I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review, and this is the Book Review Podcast Special Edition. This summer, in addition to our regular episodes, we'll have a series of interviews with authors whose books made our list of the 100 best books of the 21st century so far. Today, I'm joined by George Saunders. George is the author of several fantastic short story collections, 2 essay collections, and a novel. In the Book Review's recent poll of 503 writers and other book lovers, 3 of those titles, 3 were voted as some of the best books of this century: Pastoralia, 10th of December, and Lincoln in the Bardo. George, welcome to the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you for having me. You have a great radio voice, too, by the way.
Thank you. I'm glad I work at a newspaper. We do it all now. We do it all.
Yeah.
We're going to talk a bunch about Lincoln in the Bardo. I hope that listeners have had the opportunity to experience that book, which was one of the Times' notable books of 2017. It won the Booker Prize. But just in case, should we tell them what it's about?
So basically, about 400 years ago, my wife and I were up in D.C., and her cousin pointed out up on the hill a crypt. We could just barely see it. And she said, "Did you know that when Lincoln was president, his son Willie died? And supposedly the kind of gossip of the time was that Lincoln had gone into the crypt several times in this extreme grief he was experiencing and in some way interacted with his son's body." I said, "No, I did not know that." And it blew my mind. And at that time, I couldn't see any intersection between that story and my writing style. I was doing a lot of futuristic, dark stories, but I treasured it up in my heart. And about 20 years later, after thinking about it and trying to write a play, I wrote this book in which Lincoln comes to the graveyard and has this experience with his son at the lowest ebb of the Civil War. So that was kind of the outline of the story.
Now, that story, as you heard it, is very compelling for obvious reasons. But what do you think it was specifically about it that made it stick in your mind for so long? Was it the emotion? Was it Lincoln? What was it?
Well, at first, it was literally an image of the Pietà came to mind with Lincoln with his son's body across his lap. I mean, I'm kind of a Civil War buff a little bit. It seemed like a very dramatic time in our nation's history, and also so central still to who we are and who we're trying to become. And then there was also a more crass technical element, which was that I love the idea of something being confined to a small physical space over a short time. That seemed like something I could maybe do. But ultimately, I think these things, they adhere to you for reasons that you're not sure of at the time. And I think the fun of it is to sort of go, well, what is it about this that's interesting to me? Is it interesting enough to sustain me for a 4-year writing period? But so at that early stage, it's really by instinct. This is interesting to me in a way that I can't shake off. Or what you don't want is, this is intellectually interesting, and I know exactly how. That second thing you're not going to get a book out of. The first feeling of being a little bit mystified by your own obsession, maybe a little daunted, which I certainly was. Those are things I've, kind of learned to steer into.
And was this something that over those 20 years, I think you said it was, you were dipping in and out of? You'd read a book on Lincoln and then put it aside for a couple of years? What was to your recollection, the process of approaching it and walking away from it?
The first thing I did was I tried to write a play, and that was comical, not in a good way. It was like like a little bit of an after-school special or something, not a playwright. So I did that, and I couldn't stay away from it. Even though I knew it wasn't good, I couldn't stay away. And one time, every January, I look at what I've got in progress and make notes. And I just wrote across the top of it, "Stay away, do not do." Because it was just such a time sink. So I put that play away. But I'd read a lot of books about Lincoln, and especially focusing in on that February of 1862. And I just kept thinking for a while, this is one of those things that you want to do, but you shouldn't. And everyone has a limited talent. This is beyond your ken. So enjoy the research as a hobbyist and just forget it, because otherwise you're going to get yourself out of the circle of your expertise and get in trouble. My first book came out when I was 38. And just barely. I felt like I just finally, after all that time of working, figured out something I could do that might have some appeal. So in that mindset, you're a little bit reluctant to give it up. It was a lot of first-person, funny, edgy stories that I thought of as being Python-esque or maybe in the Vonnegut. So then the idea of doing this kind of earnest historical novel, I thought, no, that could be a disaster. So finally, when I was about 56 or 57, I just thought, wow, you could be a guy who avoids a thing he most wants to do because it's too risky, which is not a good play artistically. So I just, between me and myself, I gave myself a 6-month get out of jail free card. I said, just try this Lincoln thing again in prose. If it doesn't work, you just don't tell anybody you tried it. You're only embarrassing yourself. So that's what I had to do psychologically to allow myself the sort of stylistic variation that I thought was going to be necessary.
I spoke to Colson Whitehead as part of this podcast series about his book, The Underground Railroad, and he said something to the effect when talking about the steps that led to that book. He was thinking about this idea. It scared him, and he thought maybe it was time to do the scary thing. It was time to do, as a writer, the hard thing. The thing maybe he wasn't totally capable of doing, or at least he didn't know if he would be. And you've said the holiest state as a writer is to be a little confused by what you're doing. I'm curious how you think those two things work together. That you should be doing the thing that's maybe slightly out of your reach, and then it's also okay to be a little befuddled when you start it.
Yes, what a great question. I think it's, I think a reader, when I'm reading, I like the feeling that the writer is stretching. So I don't like the feeling that she knows what she's trying to convey and she just does it. She just dumps it on me, predetermined. That feels like a one-way communication. Whereas if you feel the writer's struggling to do something he or she hasn't done before, you feel, it's almost like if you drive by and you see somebody trying to pick up a piano, you think, oh, that's, wow, how good for you. Good. So I think that's part of it. Also, for me, that so much about a work of fiction, the plot, the structure, the style, all of that stuff, they're actually, for me, best seen as ways to crack a code, ways to solve a problem. So if someone says, what structure should I use? A meaningless question until you tell me what you're trying to do. For me, a lot of the innovation of this Lincoln book came from just running up into sort of embarrassingly insoluble problems. How do I do Lincoln? How do I get in the historical stuff that is part and parcel of why I'm interested in it? So it became this pattern of running into a problem that felt like a deal breaker. You're going to have to give up your trial period, give up. And then going, maybe that's what being innovative is, trying to find a authentic, organic solution to a really intractable problem. So I think that's when you're stretching, by definition, you're going to be encountering new problems. And hopefully the solutions that you come up with will feel new as well. So when I was writing this, it was not tedious. It wasn't difficult. I'd go into the writing room befuddled from the wall I'd hit the day before, but also with a little bit of hope, like, this book is kind of yielding to you because it's being written in the right intention, with the right intention, which is growth. So it was really a pleasurable experience of stretching, when saying, wow, look, I can write swaths of earnest prose with no jokes in them, and there's still something happening, which of course then I would immediately throw in a joke just to make sure.
What does your befuddlement look like? Are you just staring at a wall? Are you just writing through it?
Yeah, it's writing through it for me. I don't do a whole lot of off the page thinking, but it would be basically encountering the same problem 7 or 8 days in a row or 20 days in a row. Yeah, that's weird. How do I do that? So, for example, with this, there was a first draft, an early draft, that was all ghosts. And it was all right, but it felt a little bit almost like with a book with only ghosts is like a series of dream sequences. Anything can happen, so therefore nothing matters. And so the befuddlement there was just reading it over and going, yeah, it's a little tepid.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, noted. Okay, let's read it tomorrow and see if it still feels that way. It does. And finally, it starts to feel a bit like a crisis. And then I have a little bit of a moment where I say to myself, okay, this is actually a problem with your book. Is there anything easy that suggests itself to you? And I get into kind of a self-dialogue. And in this case, it was like saying, what's missing? I think the historical backstory is missing. Oh, interesting. And yeah, that makes sense, because that's why I was moved to write it, is because of it. During the Civil War, and the Lincolns had this big party, and there's a whole bunch of underpinning historical stuff that makes the present tense narrative come alive. That's true, yeah. Then a couple more days go by. Hey, by the way, any developments on that historical front? Not really. Oh, okay. Yeah, how do you know that historical stuff? I read it in a book. Oh, interesting. So it starts to percolate, and you finally say to yourself, wait, are you saying that I should directly quote historical nuggets? And the other guy says, well, it's your book. You can do whatever you want. So to me, that's what an innovation feels like, or a problem solved is a series of gentle self-interrogations. And then one day the answer is just sitting there, very obvious. It was there all along. And then that kind of, for me, really thrilling feeling of saying, it's your book. You can make it as naughty or reckless or crazy or indefensible as you want. Maybe the one thing in my whole life where I'm happy to not be a good team player. So that was the feeling throughout, several times where you just thought, that's a legitimate problem. Okay, any solutions? And then gently urge yourself to what might work.
For those listeners who haven't read the book, and if you haven't, what are you doing with your life? The ghosts that George is referring to are sort of this chorus of spirits who are in the cemetery where Willie Lincoln is interred. The book sort of alternates between hearing the thoughts of these spirits that are stuck in this in-between place between death and whatever follows death, the Bardo of the title, and then sections that sort of give you historical context. They talk about this party that the Lincolns threw at the same time that their boy was sick upstairs. They talk about the grief, the reported grief that Lincoln felt afterwards. And so you're going back and forth between these two things. You wrote recently on your Substack, which I read most of last night, the progress of a book like Lincoln in the Bardo can be seen as a series of small obstructions solved or addressed by instinct. Now, you wrote this in reference to the decision to have the attributions for all these spirits come after the dialogue, all the attribution for all the historical sources come after the text. And you wrote, what I did was blunder into it because of a micro preference, then notice it, and then let it stand. And I wonder how much this kind of discovery guides your writing. You're talking about trying to solve a problem. You come upon a potential solution, and then you just follow that as opposed to having a predisposed notion of where you should be going.
It's almost 100%, Gilbert. Early on, I had a more kind of proactive intellectual stance. I'm going to decide what I think about patriarchy and write about it. And those efforts were always predetermined. They were just me telling you my half-baked opinion. So what I found at one point was if I blundered into something without any intention and spent my energy basically working with my ear to try to make the prose, the word I think of as jangly, like prose that actually sits up and makes you take notice, whether it's funny or fast, or I like density of prose. So I found, partly by writing my first book at work, because I didn't have time to theorize, I just was sneaking little 10-minute increments. But I found that if I did it that way, the meanings would arrive on their own, and they would be deeper than the ones I could have presupposed. So that's a strange kind of leap of faith. You just say, all I'm doing today is improving this paragraph by completely personal, whimsical standard. I don't even know what it is. I just like this better than that. Like in The Optometrist almost, I like this version of the paragraph more than that. And for me anyway, weirdly, if I just keep doing that, the structures appear, a theme appears, meaning appears. So with Lincoln, it was a little more structured than a story in that I said, I know Lincoln comes in to the graveyard at night, he interacts with his son, and then at some point we know he leaves because he goes back to his job. The little boy's spirit, I thought he's there. And then I had early on the idea that he shouldn't be there just because it's more interesting. And so therefore he either stays to his detriment or he leaves. That was the whole outline. But then, and I would just hang ornaments on that by the method I'm talking about of just intuitively messing with things. It's very time intensive because for me, I have to read the book from the beginning, hopefully each day. In the thick of this, I think I was reading at least twice a week from the beginning, just to see if it's almost like you're saying, okay, intuition, tell me what to think. And it says, all right, but you got to, as much as you can, you've got to mimic the experience of a first-time reader. So let's start on page 1. And so that's a difficult thing. But yeah, it's almost all, even to this day, very intuitive with a little sprinkling of structural aspiration maybe, or sometimes you'll be reading along in that mode and think, I see what I'm doing. This is a little bit about X, or what I'm going to need is a little bit of Y. But even those things, I try to keep them really light. I try not to ruminate too much about it or invest too much in an intellectual idea of the book until it's done. Then hopefully it's got a lot of things happening that I hadn't planned.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm here with George Saunders, author of Lincoln in the Bardo, 10th of December, and Pastoralia, 3 of the books on the Book Review's recent list of the 100 best books of the 21st century. George, you write these scenes where the president is describing his grief, and they're, at least to me, they were just incredibly raw. I was on the verge of tears. It made me think things about my own family and my own child that maybe I don't want to think about during the day. The idea that they may not be around at some point. So the emotion was present when I'm reading it, but I'm wondering if it was there when you were writing it.
Yes. Usually for me, it's the first couple times I get to a scene, I can feel that emotion. And then I kind of just note that it's there and it subsides a little bit. It becomes more of a technical problem. But for me, the book it's about grief, but then I thought, actually, grief and love are the same exact thing. So if you, in this context of this book, if I represent love I felt for my kids, my wife, for everybody, and you put that love into Lincoln's mouth or his heart, and you know that his son has died, it instantly becomes grief. It's not, in other words, I think for this book, there was a lot of assuming that the grief is just love truncated. So therefore, if I could do a reasonable job of representing what it feels like to love somebody, which I certainly know that feeling, then the setup would do the work.
When you took this book out on tour, did you have, I know it's always difficult because on tour, people maybe haven't read the book or read it in full yet by the time they're seeing you at a bookstore and buying the book. But maybe since then, have you had people talk to you about the way it has allowed them to think about or move through grief in any sort of meaningful way?
I have. And it was so strange, Gilbert, because the first time it happened, I was shocked. I thought, I didn't even think about that. While I was writing it, I had a picture of Lincoln and a picture of Willie over my desk. And I just thought, okay, let's not forget that these were real people and let's try to honor them with the book. So I think that was really useful. But yeah, I've had a lot of people at every event, somebody would come up and tell me that. And that's very, very meaningful. And I think for me, the big lesson at 65 is that the great state of wisdom for me has been suffering. When everything's going well and you're winning, there's a lot of lessons that you forget about. You don't have to learn them. But when things go bad and you're reminded that we're all impermanent, no one's going to be here forever, then I think that tenderizes something in a person. And I think it actually brings out the best in me anyway, when I feel that acutely aware of that truth. So the book was interesting because every day I had to or got to go in and say, okay, this truth that Lincoln is experiencing in this book is not just his truth. And it's not just when we're unlucky. It's constant. This is actually the overtone that hangs over every moment of human life. At first, you'd feel sad or feel like, oh, this is depressing stuff. But then by year 2 or 3, I felt really grateful that I could go in and be reminded of that every day. And it started to become, I guess, celebratory in a certain way, that I had my face this close to this actual truth every day in the writing room.
There's a passage near the end of the book that in her review for the New York Times, Michiko Kakutani ended her review with, and I think it relates to what you were just talking about. I should have asked you to read this. I apologize for not setting you up correctly. His mind was freshly inclined toward sorrow, toward the fact that the world was full of sorrow, that everyone labored under some burden of sorrow, that all were suffering, that whatever way one took in this world, one must try to remember that all were suffering, none content, all wronged, neglected, overlooked, misunderstood. And therefore one must do what one could to lighten the load of those with whom one came into contact. Lincoln
Thank you.
reaches perhaps as a result of the interaction with this intense grief, interaction with all of these spirits in the cemetery, in the Bardo, this sort of melding of personal sorrow, national sorrow, and human sorrow. And it feels like, in a way, whether it's in this book or many of your short stories, that is what you're trying to get at.
I think it's what I really have felt, that I sometimes think, if you think about the person you were on the best day in your life, when you felt the most empowered and the most in touch with truth, compare that person to the one you were on the worst day, when you were most full of shit, or you were the most deluded. And the difference, I think, is that the better person has some non-delusional idea of how this is all going to end up. That luck doesn't prove virtue. If you're having a great life with lots of money and everything, it doesn't actually prove virtue. It's just luck. So that seems to me, I think it's from my early Catholic days, but I think that's the truth as I've seen it. So the best person I've ever been is the one who most fully, who is the least full of nonsense about my own accomplishments or charm or ability or luck, and just says, okay, this is a nice moment. That's purely by grace. And when you see somebody who's having a terrible moment, that also is by a kind of inverse grace. So I think that when I was reading about Lincoln, that really struck me, that he made such an incredible journey from when he was a young guy, even the beginning of his presidency, where everything was about, I'm just preserving the Union. If I could preserve the Union by keeping slavery, I would do so. And then by the end, especially that last year and a half, was unbelievable, the things he was saying and writing down. And I think he had by that time decided to give votes to Black men. He had a couple of experiences that were, I think, life-changing for him in terms of his views on race. And if you look at the chronology, there's Willie's death right there in 1862. It seemed obvious to me that there was a softening or a kind of a saddening that happened at that point that then opened up his mind to a lot of the things that he would learn in the next couple of years.
Were you worried at the beginning of just the real writing of this book that you were maybe applying the idea of a fictional character arc with a pivot point to history, to the life and the mind of a man who existed in this world?
Yes, but that's where the research was helpful, because in that early play that I talked about, there was no character development. He was just one Abe, beginning to end. And then as I started to do the research, you could see, look, there is the Emancipation Proclamation follows pretty shortly upon the events in the book. Interesting. Also, Willie died a short time after this battle at Fort Donelson, which observers at the time said was the first taste people had that this was going to be a real war. Lots of deaths, and it was going to be protracted. So you think, okay, so you've got the first real battle of the war, his son's death, the Emancipation Proclamation. So I felt the main thing was just to look into my own heart and think, what would a person go through on an evening like that? In other words, for me, the big question was, why did he go in the first place to the graveyard? Why would he leave? Or why would he not continue to come back? That seems like something like character. And then you can thread that in among the things that you know. And I think by the end, I felt I'm just making a plausible arc. And yeah, so throughout I kept thinking, just do your best. This is writing Lincoln. That's impossible. I mean, the guy's been on car advertisements in South Park. So a lot of the book was really dealing with the impossibility of writing a book like this, and then saying, okay, let's try to do my best. And like the magician who saws the assistant in half, you're not really doing it, but you're trying to make somebody who looks enough like Lincoln that it will move the reader. You're trying to make the events plausible enough that the reader gets to the end and believes that it happened. So I always think in fiction, you don't have to do everything, but you have to do something.
You have been someone who has said many times in many interviews that you're very aware that one of the things that is involved in being human is this idea that each of us is central to the universe in a way, what younger people might call main character syndrome, which is funny to hear from someone whose job it is to write characters. But I do wonder, in moments of high praise, let's say, you're talking to us because a lot of people said your books are great. And that's amazing. That's an amazing feeling. How do you take that in and not fall into that trap where you say, you know what, I am amazing. Actually, thank you for reminding me.
Natural Catholic low self-esteem syndrome to help me a little bit. But part of it, I think, is to say, I used to make the joke, if somebody eats a bunch of beans, they're going to get farty. That's not a flaw. That's just science. So what I've realized is if you get praise, you are going to inflate. Now, you have good manners, which I hope I do, no one will know about it. But I can see it myself, like, oh, I've just interviewed myself in my head for half an hour. So these things, they do happen. And I think the only way to not have it go haywire is to look at it and go, oh, interesting. I'm about 60% full of because I just got praised. And okay, maybe we can get it down to 50 so you could do some writing. And then I think also for me, I came to writing well late. And I always have in my mind the Chekhov and Tolstoy and Toni Morrison and Eudora Welty and all these great. So I think when I look at my own work, I have a very honest feeling of it not being adequate yet. So if I work, then this kind of ego inflation tends to, especially if I read. If you read a couple of Chekhov stories, you're like, oh, okay, Mr. Big Shot.
You were raised Catholic, is that correct? And for quite a while now, you have been a practicing Buddhist. How would you characterize yourself?
Somebody called me a fellow traveler. I do practice, but not nearly as energetically as I should. But
how do you think the shift in mindset about how one should move through the universe that is inherent in those two sort of philosophies has affected the way that you write fiction?
I was raised in Chicago, South Side in the 60s, so very Dorothy Day vibe. So it really hasn't been that different. The main difference for me was that in Buddhism, you get a lot of practices that you can do. And for me, again, this is just my take on it, but I felt like with Catholicism, there was a sense of you could have the guilt, you could have the sense that you failed in some situation. And the main thing to do is just a little bit be ashamed of it, Whereas with Buddhism, for me, it feels like they give you some tools to go, okay, let's start with what is shame? Who are you? Who's the person feeling the shame? And there's some kind of things that are very active that can get you off that hot seat of feeling like you're always a mess and instead see yourself as a process. So for me, it was just the practical things that I learned early on about meditation were really helpful. But I don't actually see a big distinction. I think when I imagine, for example, Jesus, I imagine somebody a lot like the Lincoln in this book, who was very much alive in the world, very much feeling for other people, very much caught in that same conundrum of how can it be that we are set up biologically and spiritually to love so deeply and it's all temporary. That's weird. When I was struggling with how to write Lincoln, my early idea of Jesus was very much there. It's almost like a Gethsemane kind of a setup. He's in this natural place, suffering with the truth of reality and trying to come through on your other end as a useful force.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is the Book Review Podcast, and I'm Gilbert Cruz. I'm here with George Saunders, author of Lincoln in the Bardo. George, what do you remember from putting this book out, from putting it out, publishing it in 2017, the response? Were you worried that people wouldn't get over the hump of the sort of destabilizing first 10, 15, 20 pages? And then when did you realize, actually, people are really into this book?
That was the funniest thing when I went out on the road. People would say, I bought your book. Yeah. And I read the first 30 pages and wow. And then you say, well, did you go on? Well, so there's a lot of stories of people who read the first 30, threw it across the room, but then would go later and pick it up. So I had some sense when I was writing it that first 30 might be a bit of a challenge. Although I really worked hard to make it seem to me at the time as user-friendly as I could. But this book came out just after the Trump inauguration. So there was an interesting energy of people reading the book and then wanting to talk about presidents and politics and the American idea and so on. So I felt like a really rich time to be able to be out on the road. The thing I really remember was I had this experience that I think so many young writers, or I certainly dreamed of it, which was in doing the last third of the book. I was up teaching at Syracuse in the fall, and we had a little house up near Oneonta, and I had a writing shed off a little bit in the woods. And I had about a third of the book left. And it was just a series of days that were so beautiful. I was there alone. I was working 12, 14 hours a day. And the book was just like surrendering itself to me. You know, I always talk about a book, in the first half of a book, you throw some bowling pins in the air. In the second half, you catch them. Those bowling pins were just raining down. And then sometimes I would almost catch one and it would say, hold on a second. I've got a better idea. And would go back up and split into two and come down. But it was really the feeling of receiving a book. There was no pushing. There was no stress. I didn't go to bed worrying that I'd screw it up the next day. So that was a rare thing. And I don't exactly get that feeling with the story, but with this longer form, all the kind of grinding I'd done in the first half, it was almost like that had created certain solutions for the ending that were going to deliver themselves when I needed them. And it was one of the most, it wasn't work-free, but it was effort-free, if I could put it that way.
Did it make you want to write more novels? You know, when this book came out, everything was about how this is George Saunders' first novel. He's been writing amazing short stories for all these years, and finally, a long book.
It was so fun. Before I wrote this book, I talked to a friend of mine who's a great novelist and story writer, and we were having lunch. I said, frankly, so what's the difference in reception between a story collection and a novel? And without even batting an eye, he goes, 5-1. And seems about right. So yeah, I was very pleased with that, but also this feeling of having bigger bowling pins higher in the air was really nice. That book was, for me, a perfect storm because I was obsessed with the material. I had a really long warm-up time with it. And then somehow it all clicks. I don't know if it'll happen again, but I was so grateful to have been in that. You know, we talked earlier about accomplishment and attention and so on. After all these years, I've realized that the only thing you can bank on really is the experience that you're having while you're doing it. And books come and go, writers get forgotten, they get overlooked, they get overpraised. But I'll never forget that fall in the shed where I felt really powerful, but also a conduit for something that was not me. And that was an incredibly beautiful feeling. And even if people stop reading the book tomorrow, that feeling, I still would treasure it. But I hope they won't stop reading it tomorrow. Au contraire.
Yeah, to be clear.
Buy 6 copies and read them all.
I read that during the tour for this book, you would get to a place, a bookstore, a venue, and because much of this book does feel like a play in that there's sort of dialogue and sections, even though it's not a play, you would get people from the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, get people from the audience to read a section, and it was almost like improv. You would say, you, and you come up, and you're number 1, you're number 2, you're number 3, and sort of a moment would be created spontaneously. How did you come up with the idea? What was it like when it went well? What was it like when it didn't go well?
Always went well. And,
okay.
And partly was because it was ad hoc. The audience was always forgiving. It went well because people were so vulnerable. They would just get up and read. So that I had the idea, like we talked about earlier, how the book was written. I was like, oh God, what do you feel about this? I do not want to read 8 pages of multiple voices. I can't do it. I don't have the capacity. Okay. So should we not do a reading? Hey, wait a minute. As you said, it's like a play. Maybe we could get people to do it. And what was amazing was how willing people were to just jump up there and read something they had. Sometimes we had a little rehearsal time before, but it was so incredible because, again, this was after that inauguration and there was a lot of angst, I would say. And so there was something beautiful about having that little community of 8 or 9 people. And sometimes it would be all women. Sometimes it would be half and half. Sometimes it would be kids. Just whoever was willing to do it would read. And it was kind of a really beautiful communal egalitarian feeling. It was really lovely.
As part of its attempt to reach new audiences, the Metropolitan Opera has commissioned an operatic version of Lincoln the Bardo that is due to premiere in 2026. Very talented woman, Missy Mazzoli, is working on this. And I'm wondering how involved you are. And then when they came to you with the idea of making this into an opera, where you're like, yes, of course, this is, to use a word that was in many reviews, a polyphonic piece. There are all these different, you can see where an aria is and you can see where a chorus goes.
Yes, I immediately said yes because I knew Missy's work and we had a great meeting in New York and it just was obvious that she totally got it. And then her librettist, Royce Favre, sent me the libretto, and it was incredible. It made me think, oh my God, why do I have so many extra pages in the book? Very linear and clean. And then we heard a version, we heard like the first, it was with piano and singers in Cincinnati last year, and it was just so beautiful. One of the feelings of writing that book was, I was thinking about it being a big dramatic production. So there is a certain operatic quality to the way people come in and off. And that was definitely in my mind. And so when they asked, I said, of course, that would be amazing.
George, I'd love for you to tell us about the book that you've read the most over the course of your life.
It's this one. It's the Collected Tales of Nikolai Gogol. And I've got a translation by Pevyar and Volokonsky that I'm really fond of.
How old is that copy? Have you had that for a while? Or
yeah, this is probably 7 or 8 years. I teach it. Yeah, you've got all the marked up business there.
Very nice.
It's the classics, the nose and the overcoat. And then a couple of side stories that I like to teach called The Story of How the Two Ivans Quarreled. And another one, a flawed masterpiece called Nevsky Prospect. So I've taught these stories, and especially the overcoat and the nose, I just am obsessed with them because they have, he uses a voice that's called Skaz, S-K-A-Z. I think of it as a purposely flawed first-person narrator who we can sometimes mistake for an authoritative third-person narrator. He'd like to be thought of that way as an authority figure superior to you and the characters, but he keeps messing up. He tries to enact classic storytelling moves and screws it up, or he gets into a little bit of a verbal confusion. And so for me, that there's something about that's lovely because you can have a whole field of flawed characters, and then you have a flawed reporter looking at it, which to me feels pretty much like real life. We walk out into the street and we think that we're the stable, authoritative presence, but in fact, we're as messed up as anybody else. So Gogol really gets that effect so beautifully. And in addition, he's got, for me, in our time, we've got so many different languages going on, so many different modes of speech. And I love the idea that instead of trying to have the narrator be perfectly respectable and correct, you let the narrator also be out of his mind. And then you get this feeling of a pitching ship with a bunch of people drunk and ice skating on it, which I think is probably the closest to what real life feels like to me anyway.
And those two stories, the overcoat and the nose, I'm wondering if, given the way that so many of your short stories have been written with this sort of sense of unreality that is also grounded in reality, you have those two stories, one in which, I'm not going to ruin it for anyone who hasn't read it, but one in which there is a ghostly presence at some point, that's the overcoat, and then in the nose, you literally have a giant walking nose that is walking around, which are two completely absurd situations. What have you taken from those two stories in terms of how to balance reality and unreality?
I think when I first read them, I just found them really funny, but they resonated with my life. And I think I read them when I first came to Syracuse as a student. And there was something about the feeling that to really get at the truth of life, you might have to depart from realism. In other words, I'd been in Texas working at a slaughterhouse and some other things and feeling really a little bit stymied and frustrated and piled on. And I thought, well, if I just wrote about a day at the slaughterhouse, that wouldn't quite get it. The facts of the thing don't fully explain the emotion of the thing. So when I read Gogol, I thought, oh, that's what. Okay, so you can invent a situation, even a ridiculous, exaggerated situation, and you're not just being silly, you're really trying to get to the essence of things. This thing we talked about earlier about suffering and the way that we're perpetually outgunned by reality, you might not be able to, I certainly can't get at that by sticking to a realist model, but sometimes I can get to hint at the hilarity of that and the desperation of that by just making something up. So that was, I think, what I took from Gogol. Because I think I maybe preferred Chekhov in a certain way, because he felt to me, or Tolstoy, they felt to me, my sort of personal lineage, Hemingway-esque, a narrator who's in control, who's precise, and who explains things correctly. So I think I liked those writers better when I was younger, but Gogol got under my skin in a way they didn't. And I think because of this idea of a flawed narrator, which I felt like myself. I have, in speech, as you can hear, I'm a little bit all over the place, a little bit inarticulate. If I ever look at a transcript of my speech, I just go, wow, that guy must, on something. So I learned early that I could try to tame that quality, or I could just attribute it. I could just say, well, okay, my narrator is a little unhinged. And that's something that Gogol is really good at. He was I think in life, a borderline unhinged person. And towards the end of his life, he went a little bananas, became a religious zealot and burned a whole novel. But at his best, he's taking that flawed human being that he is, and he's injecting it into a story with a kind of an editorial control that lets the writer himself satirize the writer himself, which appeals to me. The idea of having letting language run wild, and then in the editorial stage, cleaning it up enough to make it look intentional.
I can assure you that's what you did with this book. Link it in the Bardo. If you have listened to this entire conversation and you haven't read this book, please do at your earliest convenience. Mr. George Saunders, thank you so much for joining us on the Book Review Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, and also for including the books on the list. It was really a great couple of weeks. Thank you.
That was my wonderful conversation with George Saunders. Go read his books. I'm Gilbert Cruz, editor of the New York Times Book Review. Thanks for listening.